help out for today's lesson in lofting and creating this organic surface. But I thought I would do a couple of things. One is that thing flashing, doing something strange? Anyway, so what I thought is I would show you a couple of tricks before we get into modeling this thing. So, and that doesn't read very well. So I'm going to switch my background color. I thought white would look better, but I guess it doesn't. So. Yeah, it doesn't help much either. At any rate, okay. So what I've done is I've set up a background. And if you notice the way that we did it last time, it didn't show up in the perspective. Each of those images was locked to that specific background image. So there is a way that you can build it. So let's go up to the default in layers and make the default layer the basic one. And once you have that current, then what you want to type, you want to get into a view, so let's say the top view, and we're going to put in the floor plan. You can type a command called picture frame. And picture frame will allow you to load an image, and it actually makes it a surface that's projected onto it. So you have a little bit more capability to scale it. So here you can see some of the options that we can have. It's self-illuminated. We could make it a light. Has some alpha transparency if it has it in the image. But basically, I'm just going to open it. And you can see that it's an image and that it has this property. So if I grab it, I can scale it multiple ways. The problem is that well, the benefit is that it comes into the perspective view. So when you're laying out more complicated geometry, you can see both of them at the same time, and that can be pretty helpful. But the downside is really that it becomes kind of an edited surface, and so sometimes you may not want to see that in the perspective views. You just want to see it in the background and the foreground. So that's when you would start to use this tool. So just like the other, not like the other, you can edit this thing just as you would any other type of surface. So if we go down here to the scaling tools, we have access now to scale it in one dimension. So you remember we had a problem with it being just a little bit out of aspect ratio. Well, here we can come down, snag that point, and we can grab whatever point we're going to do, and we can scale it in just one dimension. You can see in the perspective view how it's just changing in that one dimension. So that means that if you have something that's just a little off, that you can get those tight and put together. So that command is picture frame. I usually put it on its own layer when I do the picture frame. So if you see the background floor plan, I'm just going to delete this since I already have it in here. So if you turn on visibility back to the background, you'll see that they're there, and right next to on the layer is a little lock button. Now let me pull it up so you can see it. There we go. Now you can see everything. So this little lock here, we can lock and unlock layers. So now when it's locked, now it's not going to be selectable, and now it's strictly a background and it's a guide, and it's not going to get us into any trouble. So that's something that's a very handy little tool to keep in mind as we move forward. So now what we have here is the background images. I've scaled them, I've put them together so that they work, and you'll also notice that because I'm using this this elevation here, I had to flip it to make it orient properly with the perspective view. So you can see that we have this entry here, and if we just put it in normally, I had to flip it to make it work, to lay it, to get it to set right. Okay, so with that, I just wanted to go over a couple of things with you about how this should work. And let me see here. I think what I need to do is go to the front. I think when I put this one in, the elevation, I got distracted and didn't finish scaling it. So let me unlock that layer. Oops. Select it, and I'm going to do scale 1D. I'm going to go from the 0 point. Well, first of all, I'm going to move it, make sure it's moved in the right position. I'm going to turn off these other curves that I've created just so that I'm working on it. Selected. Move. Want this corner to be at 0. Okay. There we go. Now everything is happy again. Just got moved. So what I just did, so that you are following along, just select that front elevation, and I picked this corner point here, and I just typed move, selected this corner point, and typed in 0 so that it moved to 0, so that that base point that I'm going from is the same. Lock those layers down so that they're not going to be selected anymore. I'm going to go to the perspective view by going down to this tab. And so now we should be all set up. Everything's aligned. We can see both sides. The other thing that I did is that when those things are selected, I'm going to unlock this layer for a moment to show you another little piece. When these things are unselected, but we can select them, and because they're surfaces, they have material properties. So let's go over here to this rainbow properties tab, and you might see it as object, but if you click over here to the paint tube, it says material, it brings up some settings that we have. I'm going to expand this panel so that you can see more of the options that we have. So we can change the color of this, but most importantly, we can change the transparency. So I turned this down to 35% so that I could see through the other side a little bit and have it be a little bit transparent. This one's at 50. I thought the floor plan was a little bit more important to be full. But that's another thing. So you can do that with any object that you have. You can turn down the transparency, and that can help you when you're modeling. So I'm going to lock those back up. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to kind of quickly go over was a couple of different ways of thinking about how you model something. And the reason I want to go over that is because I think that each person takes a piece of modeling software and utilizes it in a different way. And you have to start to understand how to conceive about modeling an object or geometry before you start to attempt to do it. Yeah, and that is a synergy between what the tools that a software provides you, whether this be SketchUp or 3D Max or Maya or Revit, and how you go about utilizing those tools. So just like if you were planning to build a chair, right, you have this conception of how this is going to build this chair, and a lot of the design of the chair is going to tell you what kind of tools you're going to need. If it's something like a shaker chair, you know, you could probably get away with pretty simple table saws because it's pretty simple. You could probably deal a lot of it by hand and with just very simple tools. But if you do something like trying to build an Eames chair, where it now is a bunch of bent plywood, and so that means that there's a whole different set of tools that you're going to need, vacuum presses and all kinds of other stuff to make those things happen. So that's a long way of saying that anytime you have an object that you're going to try to model, it's good to think about the steps of how you're going to do it, kind of strategize how to approach the object, and then realize that your way is not the only way. So the way that I'm showing you, there's probably 4 or 5 different ways that you could model this. So what I thought is I would show a couple of ways in which how I would approach modeling, like the outside of this box. And then we're also going to show a couple of different ways. So my way would be to think about this as curves. Like I told you, I think in terms of curves and building as guideposts. So I'm going to select this rectangle. I'm going to click 0 because that's where I want my starting point. I'm going to turn off ortho. And I'm going to switch to the top view. And I am just going to come over here. And like I was mentioning to one of your classmates, you want to think about getting in the center lines of these lines that are coming from a raster rather than the outside edges, because those line widths are all based from the center, so the dimensions are going to be more stable if they're based on the center. Okay, so I've got that. I know I have 2 of those. That's going to be my outside edge. So I know I'm going to copy that. So I'm going to go to my front view. I'm going to type copy. And I'm going to make sure that down here my ortho snaps are turned on. And I'm going to make sure that end is turned on. That way I can snap to the endpoints of these things. But I'm going to type 0 because I know that that's where I want to go. And then I'm going to turn back on ortho because I know I want to go straight up. And if I type in 3130, because I know that's my dimension, then there I go. Click on it. Now I've got my 2 pieces. If I go to perspective, you can see that I have my 2 frames. Then the next thing I'm going to do is I know that there's this flat edge around the front. So I'm going to go to my front. And I'm basically going to create that as well. So I'm going to zoom in here. Start at this corner. I'm going to anticipate that I need the ortho turned off again. And it's going to go to this other corner. And while I'm here, I'm just going to do this inside edge too, since I know that I have to create another rectangle here. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Try to get it as close. And go down to this other corner. And then here's where sometimes the ortho snap can get you into trouble. So sometimes you have to turn that off to make that work. But in this case, what I want to do is I want to make sure that these things are aligned. So I would turn on the smart track down at the bottom so that I can click over here and then turn on the object snap. Hover over this end point, and then when I drag it across, it should give me what I want. But it's not. Okay, let's try this. Alright, so I'll show you a different way. When that doesn't work, you can always click here. So I'm just going to make it close. So I have it, and I know that I need to move this down. So I'm going to turn on the control points by clicking over here in the corner where it says Edit Points On. I'm going to turn that on, and you'll see that now I can select this point. Those 4 corners, and I can select that point, and then I'll type move from that end, and I want to make sure ortho is turned on, and then I have the intersect down here turned on the ortho snap, and so it's going to come down, and when it intersects, it's going to be lined up. And I can hit the escape button to get rid of it, or those edit points, or I can come over here and right click on that and to get those edit points off. Okay, so we know that this happens on both sides, so we need to copy both of these to the other side. So I'm going to go to my top view. I'm going to type copy. And I'm going to make sure endpoint is turned on. And it's good to have planar turned on as well in this. And I'm just going to click at that corner and click at that corner. So now I have this whole box. Hit escape to get rid of that third one that it wants to. Come on, get rid. There we go. Oh. Give me an extra set. Okay. I need to copy this outside edge one too. Okay, so now we have these pieces. I know that these need to be moved in. So I'm going to go to my top view. I have that selected. And I'm going to just use making sure that the gumball is turned on down here at the bottom. That way I can just grab this green arrow and move it on axis down to that corner. Go to perspective, select the other one. Go to the top view. Again, zoom in enough that I can move that. Okay. So now we have this perspective view, and now I can do some modeling with surfaces. So this is kind of the base point that I start from. So one other thing I'm going to do is I see that I did this top and bottom, but I want this outside edge here as well to create this surface. So I'm going to go ahead and create another rectangle using the snap. I'm going to turn off this planar for a moment. Wait, no, turn it back on. Sorry. Go to the front view. Rectangle. So now I've got that. Now I'm going to type copy. I'm going to copy from that endpoint. Zoom in a little bit, make sure to that endpoint. Okay, so now I have all of the guides that I need to start to create this geometry. So now we're going to use a simple tool called a surface from 3 or 4 points, which is this tool right over here. It's also in your surface tool. You can come over here and it's right here. So it's in the standard tool box. So what this does is it's going to create a surface by asking you to pick out the corner points. So I'm going to start with this chamfered edge over here, and I'm going to select I'm going to turn off planar, and I'm going to turn off ortho. Oop, whoa. Okay. What the heck's going on here? Someone's taking control of my computer. All right. Let's turn off this background floor plan for a second. Are you guys able to snap on that corner, or is it just my computer? Oh, okay. There we go. Yeah. Good call. Thanks. Okay, so now I can just select these 4 points, and that starts to create that corner surface. That's the surface from 4 points right over here. It's actually surface from 3 to 4 points. So we can just keep repeating that tool. You can hit the space bar to just do a repeat. I screwed up. So you don't want to cross them when you do that. You want to go in one direction. And then the other thing is to think about modeling smartly, in the sense that we know that the other side is basically the same. If we select those, we can mirror them onto the other side and save us having to go through that. So we can select all of the surfaces, type mirror, and then it gives you some options up here. And what we want to do is select the copy, and we want to turn that to yes. Okay. Then the next thing we want to do is we want to select the midpoint of this as our point of mirroring. So we'll type mid. And sometimes you have to go into an upper view to make it work properly. Or we can sometimes just put ortho on. There we go. Bam. Done. Okay. And then we have a couple of things that we need to do in terms of making this front part. So here's another tool that we can use. So I made those two rectangles. I can select both of them, and if I go to my surface tools and I go surface from planar curves, since they're both on the same plane, as long as they're on the same plane, I should be able to select that, and it will create that surface. So now I have those edges. Now you can see where my guesstimating hurt me on moving that second line, that those weren't exactly aligned. But that's okay, we can fix that. We just select those. Now I'm going to zoom into this corner here. I'm just going to type move. Select that corner, done. Then we can select these. And our handy scale 1D tool will come in handy again. So I'll type scale 1D. And I'm going to select this corner here. I'm going to zoom in, select that corner, and then just snap it back to that. And now we're back. Everything is kosher. And now that I have this surface, I'm just going to select that, and I'm going to copy it from that point to that point. Done. Hit escape to get out of it. And now the rest of the outside of the box, I can just use this rectangular plane. This is under the surface tools and rectangle. Now I can just select these points. It's not wanting to do that. All right, go back to the 3-point. There we go. And we've modeled the outside of the box. Okay. So we've got our boxes, we have them modeled. It's pretty much ready to go. So that's one way of doing it. So I'm going to put that as, go down here, and I'm going to change this layer to curve as guide. Control A, select all of it, and then just click down at this bottom. And I'm going to move that to that surface, or to that layer. I can lock that and turn that off. Now I'm going to show you a different way. This is the Boolean way to do it. So back to default, turn back on our plans. And so this is what we would call a solid modeling, and we'll be using a subtractive idea. So we're going to create, like we were doing in Illustrator with the Pathfinder, we're going to create shapes and then we're going to subtract things from it. So we're basically going to carve out this box. And depending on how you think about it, this could be a really good way, or it may not make any sense to you at all. But it's a definitely valid option. So now we're going to go back to our standard tool set, go to box down here in the palette, and zoom in. Make sure ortho is turned off because otherwise we get squares. So we click on that, that creates the base. Now we need to go to the front. So we know how tall to make this. Okay, so now we have our box. Then we're going to create another box. This time it's going to be that inside. So I'm going to start here. And I'm not going to matter so much about this at the bottom lining up. So one of the things you want to think about when you're doing booleans is that you don't necessarily want things to be absolutely coplanar that you're going to be cutting out, because that can sometimes be dividing by 0 and cause the computer to crash. So it's usually best to have it just a little bit over. So I'm going to go to the top view. I'm going to make this one big. And then I'm going to take this so now we can see what we have here. Turn on my gumball. Okay. It's a little strange. I'm just testing something. My oh, all right, sorry. Figured out what I was doing. So I'm going to turn off this filter. There we go. So what that was, you see this up here, I didn't talk about it, but if you click on this filter tab, you can, it brings up this menu. It probably pops up down below for you guys, but I just moved it up to the top. But this allows you to filter what things are selected and what things aren't selected. So the last time I was using, I was selecting just control points. So that can be helpful when you start to get complicated. But I'm going to turn filter off. Delete that guy. Select that, and then what I'm just going to do is move this a little bit. So now we can see this inside and out. And what I'm going to be able to do now is just subtract. So if I go to the solid tools, and then here's our Boolean functions are the first 4 tools over on this side. So we can join those two together. We can subtract one from the other. We can get the intersection of where both of those are, or we can have it split so that we get all 3 components. So what we want to do is use the subtract Boolean difference. Okay, so the first thing it's going to say is select the surfaces you want to subtract from. So that's this bigger box. And then once we have that, hit enter, and then it's going to say subtract what. We're going to do that. So now we have this here that we can start to work with. So then there's a couple of different ways that we can think about creating that chamfer. We can split this surface and we can explode it, and we can edit each of those individually. That's one way that we can do it. So that's the first way I would think about doing it. So if I have this as a surface, all of them are selected, and then I can use this explode tool, which is right over here, and it's also on the standard toolbar there. And basically what that'll do is break it into its component pieces. So now I can select each surface individually. Okay? And there's a couple of other things that we know that we want. We're going to need a crease right here. So I want to split that surface. So I'm going to just create a line that's going to be my cutting tool from there to there. Okay. And I'm going to create another one over here. There. What happened to my other one? Okay. So now I'm going to take this surface and select it, and then I'm going to come over to here. Now we have 2 different tools. We have a split tool and a trim tool. So a trim will actually cut it away. So if I select this and then trim on either side of it, it will actually cut away that piece and delete it. Where a split will just split it in half, and that's what we really want. So I've selected the surface and I select split. It will ask me, what are my cutting objects? So my cutting objects are these two lines. I'll select both of those. You don't have to hold the shift key down or anything. And hit enter. Okay, so now what I have are three distinct surfaces. Okay, and we have this surface here. Now the way that I start to think about this is that I just want to have these edges move. So if I select all three surfaces inside, and I select the three surfaces on the outside, and then I turn on these edit points, control points, sorry. Now you'll notice that the control points actually start to have this outside surface as a piece because that was part of the subtraction. So the way it's defining this model mathematically, it still has that piece there as a piece of that. So there's a couple of ways that we can do that. One, we could have it redefine. I just hit escape to get rid of that. We could have it redefine that feature, or we can, which is rebuilding the surface, but I don't want to get into that right at the moment. Let's try this a different way. So I'm going to use my handy scale 1D again. Click here, make sure that my ortho is turned on. So I want to move this stuff in a line. Okay. That's moved. Select the right thing here. There we go. Oh, I see what's happening. There's two things that we forgot to do. So let's do a couple of things. So we have this chamfer that we have to create. So let's go to our front view. Let's zoom in and we'll create that rectangle that we're going to use to trim. Make sure your ortho is turned off, you'll get some weirdness. So I'm going over to the front, that's where it's on that plane. So now I can select just the curve, and I'm going to click trim. Then it's going to ask me to select the object that I want to trim. Now, whichever side of the line, the curve that I pick is what it's going to delete. So I want to delete the inside of that surface. And so it's trimmed off that surface for me. So now I have that edge. And then what I would do, oops, I would just delete these, copy over this new phase. And old habits dying hard, I would probably go back in here and reconstruct the pieces like I did last time with the surface, and then rejoin all of them. Okay? The other way, oh, let's do it this way. Let's back up. The other way that I could do this too is that I could create that chamfered surface, that chamfered surface, which would require me making that that kind of guide object anyway. So I could subtract that. But since I have to do that anyway, it doesn't make any sense to do it twice. So just do it and build that chamfer like we did on the previous, using these surfaces as the guide. Does that make sense? Okay. So we've got those two. So those are two different ways to kind of think about how to develop and build the project. So I'm just going to delete this since we already have this one. Okay, so now we have this outside edge. That was very quick, but generally that should get you the gist of how to build this outside surface. Now, of course, what we have here that we're not showing is that we have, if we go back and turn on our plans, and we go to the front view, we can see that this still has to come down at an angle. We have to create those surfaces and bring those down as well. So that piece that we just did still has some work to do to get it up to snuff. Okay, but let's go to turn on the stacked curves layer. You guys all see this now? You got the same thing? Okay, so what I've done is we're going to show a technique called lofting. So just like the previous way, there's several different ways that you could attempt to make this surface. One is you could create a surface and using the control points try to edit that surface into place. There is a way in which we could maybe make a top curve and a bottom curve of this. So we could say, okay, I'm going to have this top curve and I'm going to have this bottom curve. And then what I'm going to do is try to understand this shape in terms of sections and create this section profile several different places along this curve, and then just have it blend between those shapes. So like in a case, let me just show you how that would work using this curve and this curve. So we know that I have here, I have this sort of bench area that we're trying to create, this seating area. So I would take, for me, an interpolated curve, and I would click on this endpoint, and then I would start to draw let's say the profile of this thing. I'll turn off ops snaps for a minute. I'll turn it back on just to get to that end point. Okay, so I have this is one of those profile curves. So what I can do is I can say I want to, well, let's double check. Okay, so because I did it in perspective, it did some weird stuff. So let's go to the top view. That's where the project and the planar being turned on helps out a ton. But I'm just going to turn on these edit points. Select those points, and then I'm going to type set PT, set point. And I want them looking down here at my arrow, this tells me my coordinates, I want them on the X position. And then I can just go over here and snap on that, and that aligns them all together. Okay, so back to our perspective view. Oh. Let's go to the right. So now I'm just going to edit these, move these around a little bit. So when you're doing these kind of these more intense shapes, there's a lot of moving between different orthogonal views to get the shapes exactly the way you want them. And that's where that little record history function that I showed you briefly becomes really important, because you can create a loft, create the surface, and then you can go back and edit the curves that made that surface and keep them nice and clean and tight. And it automatically recreates that loft surface for you, so you don't have to redo it over and over and over again. So I'm just moving these into some sort of bench-ish look. So I can move it X or Y independently, but if I click on this little thing, I can move it in those two, constrain it to those two directions, which is handy. Okay, let's go back to the perspective. That's rough, but it'll work. Hit escape to turn off those points. Now if I type, there's a couple of different ways we can get to that. The sweeps are generally in the surface tool, so we can go to the surface tabs up here. And if we go down here, we have sweep by one rail, so I can say just choose one of the rails and it will sweep by. But the fact is that each of these two curves are very different, so I want those to stay aligned. So I want to use the sweep two rails. So I select the first rail, which will be this bottom, and then I'm going to select the second rail, and then it's going to ask me for the cross-sectional curves, which is the thing we just created. And I'll hit enter. And you can see that it's created that surface, and it's tried to maintain that shape, that section throughout. But it morphs it as it goes to interpolate it between the different curves. So it's very different looking right over here, for instance, than it is on the other side. But it still has that same shape. But we know that that is not exactly what this shape is about, so we would have to put multiple curves. So it would start to, let's say, straighten out around this edge here. So let's undo that. Oh, cancel. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is just make one more curve here. I'm going to go into the front view, I'm just selecting those two so I can make sure that I know which curves I'm looking at. And then I am going to turn on planar. And I am going to turn on near on the object snaps. And I'm going to go to standard, and I'm going to create another curve. So near gets me to snap next to this thing. Hit enter, and that creates that curve. So now if I go into perspective, now I have these two curves. So now I have two sections that I can start to morph between. So now if I do that same sweep 2, so I'm just going to type sweep 2, select the bottom, select the top. I'm going to select this curve, and I'm going to select this curve now. Now when I hit enter, it gives me a different shape, right? And so between those two curves, and then what I want to do is select another curve at the end. And so I know that I have another bench here, so I would create another sectional curve as a bench, and then an ending curve, and then I can sweep along that whole surface to create that surface. Okay, but you'll notice that if we really want to follow what they're doing, then we'd have to go back and edit multiple kind of curves, because if we look here at the front, I'm going to cancel this. You can see that these things fall off in several different stages. So to do that accurately, I'd have to create a sectional curve there, probably another one here, another one here, another one here, another one here, so that I get that transition between those, that fall off on that section. So, and this is a way of thinking. What's really good about 3D modeling in Rhino and using these organic tools, it really makes you think about how you describe geometry and how you think about sections. So that's one tool, but probably the better tool to start to look at is what we call a loft. So using those same curves, I'm going to get rid of these cross-section curves. When you're building a complicated shape like this, you're not probably going to be able to do a loft and get the whole thing done in one go, because there's a lot of ins and outs, and there's these plateaus. And what a loft does, you remember when we created this interpolated curve? So when I draw a curve, let's say, I'm going to go to the top view just to demonstrate. When I draw this curve using interpolation, so it's straight between those two, but once I click that point and I start to draw the next one, the relationship of where that next point is in relationship to where I draw it changes the curve. And so when you do a loft, it's looking at the same kind of geometry. It's trying to interpolate between that. So that surface is going to have bulges and things like that if I only have 3 curves, right? And it may not give me exactly what I want. So it's best to build this up into sections and build it one by one so that you can get a better approximation of what you want to do. Because if I tried to do it all, for instance, let's go over here to perspective. Like if I had this surface down here flat and I had 2 of them stacked right next to each other, and then I had one above it and further away, it would create this weird kind of curve between the 2 of them, and you would get this crease in here. So you have to build it and then modify the geometry a little bit, build it. That's where record history comes in to develop it. Now, this is a little bit different in the sense that we're trying to replicate geometry. When you're creating your own geometry, it's usually a little bit easier because you know exactly, you can build it up into chunks and pieces. Okay? So the way the loft works is very simple. So if we go to surface, we have a couple of different ways that we can do it, but this is the loft curve right here. I don't want patch. There's the loft over on that corner. So once we select that, it's asking me what curves I want to loft. So these are the curves that I want to loft. So if I select, oh, one other thing I want to do here before I do escape, I want to turn on record history. Because what this allows me to do is that once I've created this loft, I can go back and edit those curves and fine-tune that surface. Without that, then you can't edit. There's no connection between the two of them, and then you have to just keep relofting and relofting to paint. So now we'll do the loft. Click that, select that. The other thing is it's really important the order that you select these. So if you select the top, the bottom, and then the middle, it's going to try to go back and around and give you all kinds of weird stuff. Okay. So once you select those, just hit enter, and then it's going to bring up these options, these lofting options. So as you can see, it's trying to interpolate between those, and we get this kind of round, bulgy ends and things. And so we have some options. You probably came up as normal. There's different ways that you can do it. So normal will be a little bit more billowy, loose. You can see where it's not going to be beholden to those lines very much at all. Tight, we'll try to keep to those lines as close as possible so that the surface goes through those lines. We can also do it in straight sections where that gives you a pretty simple surface. Developable, what that means is that a developable surface is one in which you could take a strip of it, unroll it, and it would unroll evenly onto a flat piece of paper that, let's say, and cut it out and then be able to form it back into its shape. It's very computationally intensive, and it oftentimes doesn't work on these super organic surfaces. You have to think about, so you'll get patches of it that are developable, and other spots it won't. So it will radically change your shape. So you have to kind of think, if you're going to try to build a developable surface, you want to start thinking about that beforehand. And that's an important concept to think about for architecture, actually, because if you want to build these kind of shapes, you have to think about how you would fabricate them. And anything that starts to have double curvature is really hard and very expensive. So you want to start to think about how you can either use straight sections or developable surfaces to do that. But for now, since this was CNC cut out and carved, it's all right to just, we're going to use tight. I'm going to click OK. So now that that's here, we can start to see that it's not perfect, and that these edges, that's not really a flat surface, seating surface that we're working on. So what we want to do is select the curve, and we want to go to the standard menu and turn on the edit points. And so now we can go and start to edit these points. And again, this is where we go from the top view to side views. So these lines here that you see in gray, these are what they call iso curves, and so what they are doing is just showing you what they call the U and the V mapping of the surface. So the surface itself, like we have an X and Y coordinate system, the surface itself has a U and a V coordinate system, which tells it helps to explain that geometry for mathematics. And it also is important for when you start to map textures onto it. It's important to know the U and the V. Now, each of these lines here that you're seeing is also has to do with what they call the definition, or kind of think about it as the resolution of the surface. So we can define it. The less u and v coordinates we have, the lower the resolution of the surface, so the more approximated it is. So the more of these lines you see, generally, the more it's going to be higher the resolution of the surface. Okay, and you can go back and adjust that. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these points here because I want to start to flatten this. I'm going to go into perspective, and I'm just going to start to tweak this surface a little bit to get this thing to flatten out the way that I want it to flatten out. And then I'll probably have to come over here and do a little bit more. I'm just showing you how to do it. In general, you probably want to be a little bit more finicky than I am. Now this is where turning on the surface or turning on this filter becomes helpful. So why don't we click on the filter? And I don't want to be able to select surface, so I basically start to uncheck everything I don't want to touch. So the only thing I really want is control points. So I'll make sure that's clicked, and then I'm just going to uncheck everything else. So the only thing that I'm editing now is control points. So now when I click and drag a selection, the only thing it's going to select is control points. And I can move into the front. And I can start to move these down. Start to get those aligned a little bit more. That guy needs to go back up. So although we started with kind of planar sections that are curves that were flat on one plane, by spacing them out a little bit and then going back and editing them to get the surface the way you want it to is generally a better way to build a surface. So once you have that set, then you could build the next set of curves above that and do the next section and loft it in sections and by piece. And then at the end you can use this join tool to join all of those together in one surface. So it's all one entity. So those are the basic tools that I want you to use to develop that. You can choose to do it whichever way, but I think this lofting and then going back and editing the curves is the important one and the easiest one to do. And remember that record history is your friend. And none of this becomes possible unless you use record history. You just have to keep relofting. So that's important. Then the next piece. So questions about that? Let's ask any sort of questions. Yeah.
Would you recommend using a lot more stacked curves to get a better resolution on lofting?
Yes, you can, but there's a danger in that too. So the important thing I think to start off with is try to get those curves that you're going to create that loft more evenly spaced on the X direction, or the Z direction, because if you have some that are tight and some that are far away, that causes some problems. So usually what I try to do is say create 4 or 5 or 6 lines. You can create more, but you have more options. It just that then go back and edit them once you've kind of created a loft to kind of sculpt it back into place. There's a fine line between having too many, because then you start to get it very time consuming. As you see, moving each one of those little points can start to be really time consuming. So it's this trade-off between what you want to get and how accurate you want to be. And like I said, when you are developing your own, it's usually easier because you could just say, here's the section I want, here's the section I want, and then the design of the shape emerges from it, which I think is really a very interesting way of designing. It's my preferred way of designing, is to think about a process and have the outcome. You had a question?
Yeah, the door up top is going to light and good.
What's that?
The toolbar is very top, yeah. Lower button.
Yeah, that comes down here in this filter.
Okay.
So you can turn that on, and it'll probably pop up down here below. And then I just dragged it up to the top, just because I feel like this control space just is kind of wasted. So, but that's how you get it, by turning this filter on and off. Other questions? Yeah. Well, that's my point, is that we are only approximating in 2 dimensions. So we don't have a very accurate set of dimensions in terms of, we don't know the spacing that they cut those contour lines at. So I'm guessing of what those are. And so if we had, that's why I say, if you knew what you're having, then you can be much more accurate. But when we're kind of guesstimating here, it's not bad to do that. And it would have been easier for us, for instance, if, although less descriptive, if we had a set of kind of contours. So what they did is they reversed it, and they did another set of section contours for the elevation, just like they did for the plan. And so we don't really have any sense of spacing. So accuracy is at best what we're going to be able to do from making sure that these things start to align with one another. You know, this piece starts to align with this piece, and they start to look, you know, some semblance of being in the same place. Does that make sense? Other questions? Think you got it? Does that seem simple? Easy? Yeah.
Just one more thing, like I see the stairs coming up onto each level of seating area, and with the tools that we have, it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to accurately model each one of those steps. How accurate are we supposed to get with those steps?
So those are the seating pieces.
Right, and then the stair pieces that we
Right, so there's no stairs.
I mean,
so those lines that you see in the plan, these things, those are an abstraction. That's a contour line. So if we go back and look at our images, you'll see that that's all just smooth stairs. And so what they used is a technique that we use for site plans, for contours, to describe a site or a landscape-like geometry. So, yeah, no problem. That's conceivable. So, and that's why we're just kind of, we have to guesstimate. So when we first did it, you saw that wasn't even a flat spot, and so that's why I was going back in and trying to make that flat spot. If I was, and I wanted to do it quick, but if I would do it again, I would probably put another line like right here, another contour line, so that I could start to control that edge lip condition a little bit better. And the one thing that you want to do is try to keep the sections between the two. When you start to make the next section, you want to modify both of those. That you, once you get this one in place, you don't want that to change. So the top and bottom of your loft, you want to kind of have set. So because that tangency, getting those two surfaces to align when you do the next one, you can't really edit that bottom one, right? Okay.
in that case, you should just take that one loft open.
Yeah. Yep, that's exactly right. And if you do record history, it will try to move the two together. But remember how in Illustrator we could have a kink or we could have a sharp curve? It would become a kink then. So if we edit it, the two wouldn't necessarily stay tangent to one another. It might actually do weird things depending on what was above or below it. So it's generally the case that when you get those two things, you just want to keep those top and bottom pieces where they're at, and then edit the ones above it. So you might do, again, you know, have that bottom curve, and then you have one just above it that allows you to control that tangency between the two surfaces. Does everyone know what I mean by tangency? No? Okay, so when we have two surfaces, okay, or a circle, for instance, being tangent on that circle means that if I have this circle, that it's actually at a it's totally aligned with it, so it's smooth. Okay, so a non-tangent would be that I have this kink, so it's not smooth, so it's not, it doesn't transition very easily from one to the other in a nice smooth way. That's what tangency is. So non-tangent means that there's a kink, that it's not a smooth transition from one to the other. There's a better mathematical definition, but I'm not a mathematician, so there's my non-mathematical one. Other questions? This same kind of thing will come in handy when we start to build topographies, but I'm going to show you another way to build topographies that's a little easier, because usually what you'll have is some existing contour lines that you can get from another source, either GIS or it's given to you, or you trace them off a plan. So I'll show you a way to build geometry off of that. Questions about the box and that modeling process? Who's already built the box? What kind of problems did you run into?
Not really knowing how to use mine.
Well, that's why we're doing it, right? So the way, just like in anything, like I told you at the beginning, you have to dive in and just start using it. Otherwise, the tool is, you'll never learn the tool. So it's like practice. If you play golf or do anything, you just have to do it. Otherwise, you just never get good at it. And I really highly encourage you to utilize it in your studio projects. Just jump in and start building your studio projects in it. I talked to Ayad, and he said that you guys are having these an assignment that's going to come up, that the Photoshop collage technique that we used would be really a great tool for that. So I told him that you've learned it, so he knows that you know how to do it. So it's a good time, again, to practice and to figure that out. And same thing with doing your diagrams. Just do them in Illustrator. So the whole point of you learning these tools is so that these follow and you can apply them in Studio. So please do so when you can. And that way you get practice. Any other questions? Any other problems you run into? Yeah.
Can you just walk through drawing like one more of those stacked components?
Yeah.
Like I know you're using for curves.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to turn off those curves, and I'm going to put this surface. So this is where the filter, see, I went and tried to select that surface. Got to turn that bad boy off. Just going to delete that. Okay, I'm going to go down here to make layer 5 current. So the way that I did it, I just went to the top view, and I went to the interpolated curve, and the first thing I did is I just started to draw this thing out. Well, we're not going to see white on white. That's not good. So, and usually when I do something like this, I'm not real worried about being close to that edge. I'd actually maybe move it in and start that a little bit over here because I can cut it off, I can trim it later, so it would be nice and flush. But basically what I did is I just started to click these points on this, and I tried to follow it, and as you could see, as long as I stay on the line, it just really is how far to the next point to approximate that curve. And it's kind of a long process, a little bit tedious. Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. So I have this curve. And then what I did is I copied it vertically, and then I edited that curve to get to the next one. So that way that the places like around this edge where I know it's supposed to be smooth, that I could keep those things in line, and with just very simple, very little editing. So I took that, I went into the front view, and then I just copied it. Making sure that the ortho is turned on. And then I just went in the top view again, turned on the control points, and made sure my filter was turned on. And then I just went and edited those control points. And I would select a section, for instance, like this, and I would just move it back to approximately where I need them to be. And then I would go in and fine-tune it. And that's all I did, and as I just drew it up that way. That way, the places like around here, just keeps it nice and aligned when I want them aligned. And you go back in and fine-tune and fine-tweak once you've created the loft even more. Okay. And other questions I can answer. Yeah.
We have a whole bunch of those lines really close together. The one you did earlier was really simple. It's so steep right there.
Mm-hmm.
Does it really make sense to have to draw 10 lines right close to each other? Or
no, that's why I say you start with just try not to draw as many lines as they've created there, because you're never going to be able to do it. We're not pushing for severe accuracy, okay? And so what we're going to try to do is approximate. I don't want this to turn into a studio project for you guys. I want you to be able to work on it and get it done and not. So all I'm looking for is for you to understand the concept and get close. And that's why copying straight up, then those things stay stacked. And then I don't need as many. I don't need to have 10 to describe the move from this one to this one, because it's already aligned. And so it'll approximate it. Okay?
So it's like when you go around the corner on the right side, they're all really close together, but then they break out into multiple ones. So then we go from 4 lines to 1 line.
No, you don't have to do that, because the idea is that description, right, is very similar to. Let's go back to those stacked curves that I had. Okay, you can see that they're already pretty close, and but they still produce what I want them to produce, even though they're not super tight, right? Does that make sense? So that super tight, having 10 lines there, is just a matter of the interval in which they cut the sections off of that to describe that shape. We're just going to cut fewer sections. So let's say we're going to cut every 5 or 6 lines. So every 5th line, that's what we're going to draw. And that's one way that you could do it. You could think about it, count those lines, but at a certain point, you're not going to be able to count those lines, right? So, and that's also why you'll notice that when I went in here and I started pushing these things down, I was only doing those curve sections to get us the base shape, and then I didn't really care about that. Those no longer became section curves, because I wanted to I needed to make them so that I could create that flat plane. So now this curve, as you can see, is now a three-dimensional curve. It's no longer just a planar section curve. And then once I have this done, once I have the shape, I could go back in and recreate those section curves and make it look nice again, nice and planar. But think about it as sculpting. You're creating a guide and a wireframe to sculpt this shape. And so, in a way, use it as a guide and then deform it how you need to make it look right. Okay? That it for questions? Okay, so record history, what it does is it records the relationship between things. So when we create a loft, it's a relationship of curves to this lofted surface. So when we do it without record history, it just says, okay, use this curve, use this curve, use this curve, create the surface, and then don't think about it being related to that curve anymore. It's its own thing. It no longer, and so I could go back and move those together. So any change in the curve actually changes the surface.
So you want to flatten out the step.
Yes. Yeah. So that's why record history is going to be crucial to be able to sculpt this back into shape. Okay. Did you have a question? Okay. Stretching. All right. So that's it for today, and utilize Eric and Byron.